I thought it would be fascinating to look at which positional groupings matter more in the postseason. I made a video like this for the regular season, and I found some pretty interesting stuff, but I wanted to do one for the postseason. Does the running game matter more, for example, when it comes to the playoffs? Things like that. And so the way I decided to do it, and this isn't maybe the most scientific way, but it's a scientific way. Basically, the way I did this was I looked at every single team that has made the Super Bowl in the past 10 years, so all 20 teams. And I just looked at where did they, on average, rank at each positional groupings using PFF grades. I know some people don't like them, but they're, if not perfect, at least in the ballpark. So that's what I decided to use, and I found some pretty interesting stuff. So this chart is the most fascinating thing. This is the average placement each team that made the Super Bowl placed in each positional category. So the one you see at the top, this is receiving core, so not just wide receivers, but also tight ends or halfbacks if they're running a route. They, on average, ranked really high in terms of PFF grades. Teams that go to the Super Bowl have good receiving cores, basically exclusively. You see 5.3 is the average placement. That's very high. Obviously, the highest average placement would be actually 1.5 because 2 teams make it every year. They're in order, so the most important positions are at the top, the least important positions are at the bottom. So passing attack, kind of interesting that passing the ball is actually slightly less important than receivers, although it's basically even. I mean, there's that one Peyton Manning season that kind of skews the data a little, so maybe it's just that, but regardless, that's pretty interesting. Those two obviously are the most important parts of football that, goes with my theory that wide receivers are very underrated. You look at the teams that make the Super Bowl, they tend to have good wide receivers. You see a bit of a drop with coverage, but coverage is still important, 8.2. And then after that, you see another pretty significant drop, and it even gets further down with offensive line, then running game, then run defense, and then pass rush. And to be clear, running game is not including run blocking, simply just running the football. Kind of surprised that offensive line and running game have a very similar impact. Maybe it's just a small sample size on some of this stuff. Again, we are dealing with 20 teams. That is a bit of a small sample size, but I think it's enough that you can kind of get an idea for things. Yes, pass rush is at the bottom. And again, keep in mind, the average here, if it was just taking all 32 teams, would be 16.5. So they're barely better than that. I mean, the reality is for pass rush, I constantly say this because it's true, it just doesn't matter as much as people think it does. It matters. All these categories matter, of course, but would you rather have a great, a top 5 receiving unit or a top 5 pass rush? Using these numbers, I think that's a pretty clear way to think about it. Like, look at this chart. So what you see on this chart, this is the times a bottom 17 ranking unit made it. So basically for the receiving cores, if you didn't finish with a top 15 grade in receiving core, you did not make the Super Bowl in the past 10 years. It hasn't happened. And the passing attack, passing the ball, so quarterback play, that's only happened once, and that was the Peyton Manning season, which was kind of a lot of things had to go right for that to work. For coverage, it's happened a number of times. There's a few more for coverage. That's a little bit surprising. So it seems like while coverage is a category that it matters, there have been teams that have been able to overcome not the best coverage unit. Offensive line, running game, and run defense, all a little bit worse than coverage, but not much. And then pass rush, the worst of the group. Literally half of the top teams that made the Super Bowl in the past 10 years had a bottom 17 ranking unit. Meanwhile, let's look at the other side now. These are the times a top 5 ranking unit made it. So top 5 best units, how many of them out of the 20 made it? For the receiving game, you have, receiving game and passing game, 13 of the 20 had a top 5, either receiving core or quarterback play. Coverage just barely behind at 12. For the other categories, again, it's okay. It matters to some degree, but it's not as dramatic as you might expect. The one notable thing, though, is it seems like pass rush did have a decent amount of top 5 units make it. So kind of my thesis on pass rush has always been that if you have a really good pass rush, that still does matter. But if you don't, it doesn't matter that much. You need to have a really good pass rush. And even if you do have the really good pass rush, it's still nowhere near as important as a really good coverage, passing game, or receiving play. People don't like that, specifically TJ Watt stands. But listen, that's what the numbers say. And if you want to say, well, what about the way teams game plan around pass rushers? Teams game plan around corners too. Teams game plan around whoever is a good player. So now let's look at some individual categories, because it seems like top 7 in certain individual categories matters. So for example, quarterback play. 15 out of the 20 teams that have made the Super Bowl in the past 10 years, so 75% of teams that make the Super Bowl have a top 7 quarterback. So the teams that are still in the 2021 playoffs, which take place in 2022, it's a little confusing, but this season, teams that are still in the playoffs as of I'm recording this video, which is before the divisional round, that have a top 7 quarterback is Tampa Bay, Cincinnati, the Rams, and the Packers, with an asterisk on the Packers. Again, I'm using PFF grades, and the Packers passing attack does not have a top 7 grade, but Aaron Rodgers himself does, because Jordan Love played that game. That brings it down a little bit. Maybe that's unfair to include Green Bay, but I'm going to include them here. Meanwhile, the same number for receiving core. 15 out of 20, or 75% of teams that make the Super Bowl have a top 7 receiving core. So I'm putting wide receiver, but it's not just receivers. Like I mentioned, tight ends and halfbacks are included. The teams that are still in the playoffs who have a top 7 wide receiving core is San Francisco, Cincinnati, Green Bay, and the Rams. And meanwhile, for coverage, it's a little bit down, but pretty close. 13 of the 20 teams, so 65% of the teams that make the Super Bowl have a top 7 coverage unit. That's the Buccaneers, the Bills, the Titans, and the Packers. I find this stuff very fascinating. So there's these 3 major categories that you want to be top 7 in. The 7 tends to be a pretty significant cutoff, so that's why I'm using 7 there. So you want to have be in the top 7 as many of those categories as possible. So here's some interesting facts. There has never been a team in the past 10 years to make the Super Bowl without at least one of those categories that you finished top 7 in. Not one team. 8 out of the 10 Super Bowl winners had at least 2, and 16 out of the 20 Super Bowl teams or participants had at least 2 of those categories where they finished top 7 in. 4 out of the 10 Super Bowl winners in the past 10 years had all 3, and 7 out of the 20 Super Bowl teams had all 3. And there's only been 13 teams in the past 10 years that had all 3. So that's interesting. In fact, these are, over the past 10 years, all the teams that finished with a top 7 passing game, wide receiver play, and coverage grade, and it's going from most recent to least recent. So you had the Packers this year, as I mentioned. Then you have the Buccaneers last year, who won the Super Bowl. You have the Chargers and Rams. The Chargers did win 12 games that year and were a very good team. Rams went to the Super Bowl. The 2017 Chargers amazingly missed the playoffs altogether, despite this, which is kind of an amazing stat, kind of similar to how in 2010 they had the number 1, they had most passing or most offensive yards and the least defensive yards and still missed the playoffs. Kind of another funny Charger stat. 2016, there were 2 teams that had this, and they both went to the Super Bowl and played each other. 2015, there were somehow 4 teams that had this. And it's what's also fascinating is Panthers, Cardinals, and Seahawks were all in the NFC. So only one of those 3 teams was going to get to the Super Bowl, just because it wasn't possible any other way. And for the Bengals, Andy Dalton got hurt in the playoffs. They probably would have done better had he stayed healthy. 2014, you have the Super Bowl winning Patriots. 2013, you have the Super Bowl winning Seahawks. And 2012, you have the non-Super Bowl winning Seahawks. So a lot of really talented teams here. That's what you can learn. Basically, long story short, what we already knew, these 3 categories matter, but they matter a lot. And it's a really good indicator to see who's going to win the Super Bowl by who performs well in these categories. It doesn't mean that you're going to win the Super Bowl if you have a top 7 finish in all 3 of these categories. Obviously, as you see, there are several teams who did not win the Super Bowl who are on this list, but it's really rare. As in, it's more common to make the Super Bowl if you finish top 7 in all these categories than it is to miss the Super Bowl. And I'm not including the only playoff teams. I missed overall in the past 10 years. So that's pretty fascinating. Of course, this might be a little bit misleading because, okay, if you finish top 7 in any 3 positional categories, that's going to help you, of course, because, even if you finish top 3 in these 3 categories, doesn't mean that you might also finish top 7 in some other categories as well, so that would make it even better. So you could argue it's a bit misleading, but I don't think it is. And anyways, I wanted to kind of apply this to the teams that are still in the postseason. What can we learn about the 8 teams still remaining? So I wanted to see, okay, how many of the teams still remaining, where do they finish in these big 3 categories? Kansas City is the only team with 0 top 7 finishes in these 3 major categories. categories. Now, some people, and only team remaining, obviously, there were plenty of teams, over the course of the season that didn't have any top 7 finishes. But of the 8 teams left, Kansas City is the only one. And some people will sit here and say, wait a second, how is Patrick Mahomes not a top 7 quarterback? Well, if you watched a lot of Patrick Mahomes games this season, you can see why. He had some amazing moments, but he had some bad games as well. So if you're a Chiefs fan, you're saying, okay, he didn't get a top 7 grade, but he's a top 7 quarterback. So in my head, I'm going to give the Chiefs 1 there. I think that's a fair argument to make. He is a top 7 quarterback. There's no denying that. But that's just what the grades say. Let's move on. So these are the teams with 1 top 7 finish in any of those big 3 categories. You have San Francisco, it was their receiving core, and then you have Buffalo and Tennessee. For them, it was both their coverage. So again, Buffalo, you can make the same argument for Mahomes. Maybe he should be a top 7 quarterback in terms of PFF grade, which would then put them up to 2, which means you're a lot more likely to go to the Super Bowl than if you just have 1. Remember, 80% of the teams that play in the Super Bowl have at least 2 of these top 7 finishes. These are the 3 with exactly 2 top 7 finishes. Here you have Cincinnati, you have the Rams, and you have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bengals and the Rams, both it's coverage that is not top 7, and for the Buccaneers, it is the receiving core that is not top 7. So interesting there, and these do feel like very good teams. I mean, you look at these 3 categories, and the way you look at it, it seems like, yeah, this is a pretty good predictor of these teams' successes. Finally, Green Bay is the only team with all 3, but again, there is an asterisk there because they didn't technically grade top 7, but I would still include Aaron Rodgers, who is probably going to win MVP this year. I think it's fair to say that they're all 3, and the reason why I make that distinction where I didn't with Allen and Mahomes is Allen and Mahomes basically played the entire season. The reason, Rodgers is a top 7 PFF graded quarterback on top of it. So that's why I make that distinction. So Packers are very good, and teams that finish with all 3 of these categories tend to do very well come postseason time. So I think that there will be no difference with Green Bay. Also, just for fun, the teams in 2021 that had 2 of these top 7 performances that are out, the Cowboys and the Vikings. Both these 2 teams had a top 7 passing game and receiving game and missed the postseason. So, and it kind of makes sense too. These 2 do feel like 2 teams that underperformed. So I get that. But yeah, just a little bit of a fascinating stuff. I like doing this stuff. I think you can learn stuff about football from doing this and learn about the teams that we're currently doing. How much did we learn? I don't know, but I find it interesting. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.